Welcome to the podcast series, Us and Them, brought to you by Heidelberg University's Graduate School for Humanities and Social Sciences. Tune in for thought-provoking interviews with experts in different fields, from the social sciences to the humanities, from law to economics. Hello and welcome to the HGGS podcast series, Us and Them. Today we are going to wander in the exciting fields of psycholinguistics, computational modeling, and cognitive science. And we are going to focus on the topic of differences between the first language and second language acquisition, psycholinguistics and cognitive science perspectives. We have all had our struggles when trying to learn a second language, and maybe we are still struggling. Sometimes we blame the language itself, as Mark Twain famously did when learning German. Other times, things progressed smoothly on an unconscious level, and we didn't even feel the need to question why it felt so effortless. Maybe we simply thought we were talented at languages. But what are the scientific explanations behind the second language learning process? Which cognitive processes are active behind the scenes? To shed light on some aspects of second language learning, especially within the framework of structural priming, we have an expert in our studio, Elizaveta Savina, from the Department of Psycholinguistics at the Institute of German as a Foreign Philology, Heidelberg University. Elizaveta is currently working on her PhD project titled Structural Priming as Implicit Learning, driven by prediction errors during second language acquisition in German. Evidence from eye tracking in the visual world paradigm. So, welcome, Eliza.
Thank you for having me.
Well, before we move on to the basics, the fundamentals of your topic, I would like to start with asking you to briefly explain us your academic background.
So I come from methodics and didactics of foreign language learning. This is what I did my bachelor's in, and also I acquired a simultaneous bachelor degree in interpretation and translation. So basically, I'm a teacher of English and German, and also an interpreter and a translator for German. More translator, because interpretation, which is oral translation, requires a lot of additional skills and requires a lot of practice, which I don't have. That's why I think I'm more of a translator in this sense. And further on, I moved on to psycholinguistics and cognitive linguistics because I was very interested in how language processing works. And then I did my first master's in cognitive linguistics and the second master's in psycholinguistics.
Actually, you are working on really exciting fields, and you are concentrating on the differences between first language and second language acquisitions in the framework of psycholinguistics and cognitive science perspectives. So I would like to ask then, what was your motivation for the topic second language acquisition, and maybe did your own experiences or challenges in learning a second language play a role in choosing this research project?
Yes, of course. When you learn a foreign language, you always think about how it proceeds and why. And especially the question why is always there when you do something professionally or research something in an academic way. So you tend to see these things in detail. And of course, this was partially my motivation and my main interest. And as for the further parts of the topic of my PhDs, prediction errors in predictive coding and structural priming, this is something that I, came across when I did my master's. So my master's thesis in psycholinguistics is about prediction errors in semantics versus syntax. So I conducted an experiment where I tried to check whether our perception of semantic unpredictability in a sentence, when we do not predict some content or some word doesn't suit the context of a sentence very well, whether this mismatch is comparable to a syntactic mistake that we also don't anticipate. And what I found out, which is not 100% evidential because it is just one study that you cannot extend to the whole population in the sense of inferential statistics, but I did find that semantic unpredictability elicited less mismatch or less, so to say, prediction error behavioral correlates that are prolonged reaction times than syntactic errors. So I made a conclusion that probably grammatical mistakes are more salient for us. to perceive, and semantically ambiguous context is more, well, we are more accustomed to it and can deal with it better and don't feel perplexed so much, which was only my interpretation.
Actually, it's really interesting to learn that grammatical part of this maybe understanding process or cognitive process is more relevant in your research. And before moving on actually to explaining, to delving into the content of your research, maybe we should also clarify, concretize some of the concepts and some of the categorizations of your topic. So I'd like to start with asking actually, because we are talking about the structures and patterns in second language acquisition, in which ways does second language acquisition differ from the first language acquisition, and to what extent can insights from the first language acquisition be applied to second language acquisition, particularly within the framework of your research? Of course, we are restricting ourselves within the framework of your research.
Yeah, so it also nicely suits the topic of the podcast, us and them, as within us, maybe native speakers and them, foreign language learners, or vice versa. So definitely these are two processes that get differentiated a lot in the research. And even though it is all about online processing of the language and also language acquisition, first language acquisition is different from the second language acquisition in the sense that it is more biologically timed. It is more natural in development. So for first language acquisition, we have a sensitive period, so to say, where we are apt to acquiring language the most as children. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that most of our cognitive abilities and perceptive abilities that we have, they have a sensitive period, such as vision. So at some point of time in your childhood, you have to be exposed to a specific environment like depth and color so that it can develop. The same thing goes for language. You have to be exposed to linguistic environment. And then you start acquiring this language, mostly via implicit learning processes in first language. And second language acquisition, in comparison to that, is more explicit, meaning that there are conscious strategies that we acquire, usually in an educational setting with explicit rules, and also conscious, aware acquisition of vocabulary, such as associating. And also, second language acquisition can be implicit, and this is increasingly more understood in the recent developments of psycholinguistic research. But I have to say that second language acquisition is more variable, because with first language, we all have the same starting point, so to say, if we're the native speakers of the same language. But L2, or second language acquisition, is defined by very various motivation, age of starting learning the language, also setting. Some people start learning language for, specialty purposes, like for learning to translate or maybe to teach this language. Others are just learning this for their branch of work or out of interest. So there are more variables that make it very different.
I'd like to concentrate on one of the important terms that you used when explaining about this second language acquisition, which was implicit learning. So we can say that there's a difference between implicit and explicit learning in language acquisition. So in practical terms, maybe, what is the difference between implicit and explicit learning in the context of second language acquisition?
So explicit learning of a second language, it is something that we know very well from school and from university if we learn language professionally. And this is, as I said, when we consciously acquire the patterns and try to realize what is the structure of the language with specific strategies, maybe with drill grammatical exercises. And also, this is a very conscious acquisition of vocabulary where we try to see through the etymology of the word to memorize it, associate it somehow. It is also conscious in phonological acquisition that we pay attention to how we pronounce things. And whereas implicit learning dynamics are a little bit different in their nature. So this is an inference of structural regularities of the language that we don't really realize. So we are exposed to the linguistic environment where specific frequencies or regularities exist, like, for instance, the distribution of active and passive sentences in the language. Active is definitely more prominent, in particular in German language, at least, and such distributional patterns. We notice this and acquire this implicitly. So it's kind of like the statistical learning in infancy. It does work for second language acquisition, but there is evidence that it is not as strong as for first language acquisition. And there is also neurological evidence that first language acquisition and second language acquisition, they're different in neural sense. They require different, not pathways, but neuronal assemblies to be activated, because we have to think about, again, in regard to explicitness and implicitness. Explicitness requires much more executive control and maintenance in our attention, in our working memory. This is a very demanding cognitive job to speak a second language, so to say. And the first language is not that demanding in the sense, I think, because it is very procedural. It is automatized. And this is, again, this brings us to the point of difference in implicitness and explicitness. Implicit learning relies very much on procedural, automatized processing that we do not notice.
Actually, maybe as a follow-up question, because there's a rich literature on this first language acquisition, and there are many different theories, behaviorist theory, implicit learning theory, and also interaction theory. So, but would you say that whether this implicit learning can be aligned with any of these theories in a cognitive science sense?
I think that in a historical development of cognitive science, for instance, or generally historical development of sciences, every further theory is based on the previous ones. And we have this nice pattern of general accumulation of humanity knowledge, which together brings us to something novel. So I think that approaches that are contemporary or a little bit newer than the other ones, they do imply some parts of the details of the older ones. So I think that implicit learning definitely contains some behavioristic approach parts and other paradigms that have been established before.
Yeah, that's also an answer in terms of the progression in the science, philosophy of science, and how science actually works. And then I'd like to ask, partly related with this categorization that we talk about, this second language acquisition and first language acquisition, also implicit and explicit learning. I'd like to focus more on the difference between learned knowledge and acquired competence, because you are also concentrating on this theme, actually, on this concept in your research proposal. So how can learners move from consciously learned knowledge to fully acquired linguistic competence?
Yeah, this is very relevant, a very relevant distinction. But I would like to say that these terms, acquisition and learning, they can be used as scientific terms or commonly, so to say. And in an everyday sense, I think that they are very similar, but in a scientific sense, they are differentiated in a sense that acquisition, this is exposure. This is a meaningful exposure that resembles children's first language development. And this is implicit in its nature and mostly subconscious. And learning, on the other hand, according to approaches that differentiate these terms, is an explicit rule-based knowledge acquiring. Yep. That is often tied to formal instruction in learning setting.
Actually, I also tried to understand this difference between learning and acquisition, but in preparing my questions, maybe I should also clarify that I couldn't really manage to differentiate between this learning and acquisition part, so that they are synonymous for me when I'm asking these questions in terms of this acquisition and learning. But thanks for clarifying this difference between the learned knowledge and acquired competence. But I'd like to also ask you this central concept that plays a key role in your research, which is structural priming. And how should we understand this concept, actually, structural priming in second language learning or acquisition?
Before I dwell onto the structural priming, I would like to briefly say that it is completely understandable that the differentiation between acquisition and learning is not, comprehensible at the first glance, because this is one specific approach that emerged in 1980s to make this distinction. And nowadays, learning usually refers to a general cognitive process, which can be either implicit or explicit. And then, of course, it intersects with acquisition. So nowadays, I would say learning is everything that has to do with us acquiring new patterns or knowledge in any given way. And as for structural priming, let me elaborate on that. Structural priming is a very interesting phenomenon that is not only met in linguistics, generally priming. Of course, it is also a part of cognitive psychology. For instance, contextual cueing is also a kind of priming where people see, maybe crosses in a specific constellation, and then over trials, they implicitly memorize this constellation and can tell where maybe a cross that is a little bit more salient or different is placed. People acquire this knowledge without noticing it, and their accuracy and response speed just accelerates over trials, but without conscious realizing. So structural priming is something very similar that we can find in linguistics. It is called structural. Some authors refer to it as syntactical priming because it concerns syntactic structures. So this is a tendency to reuse recently encountered syntactic structures, and also they have to be encountered repeatedly. This is what makes it priming, so that we see something a lot of times, and then we implicitly adapt to what we see because we need to update our knowledge about this. So if we are surrounded by people who use passive sentences more than normal, and then we would also start doing this because we will get primed by our surroundings. I think that it has to do with the fact that when we are in a communicative act, we always activate also our language processing, and due to maybe our empathetic human nature or mirror neurons, we also tend to activate the same regions that are responsible for producing the things that we hear. So maybe when we hear something a lot, we are a little bit more prepared to produce it ourselves, because it has already been pre-activated, which makes processing easier. And generally, it is, I think, more or less axiomatic that we tend to make use of strategies that make our processing in any sense more economic, ergonomic, more efficient. So, of course, it is more efficient to use something that has already been pre-activated. Maybe this can be a potential ground for this phenomenon. And what is noteworthy is that priming effects, they accumulate over time. So the more you're exposed to priming of a specific structure, the higher is the possibility, or the higher is the probability that you will produce such a structure in a subsequent utterance. And priming effects, they can be short-term. They are visible in the experiment itself then, or they can be long-term. They can last up to 5-7 days after the experiment. This is the longest that I saw in research. And another important thing about structural priming, it is that it doesn't have a uniform mechanism across all of the constructions or structures. So it really depends on the structure that is being primed, and the effects are reliably stronger for infrequent and less expected compared to frequent structures. So this pattern is called inverse frequency effect, and this means that when we are primed for something that has less normal distribution in the language, like passive constructions that have a very specific functionality and they're not always suitable, so they would elicit better structural priming than active constructions. And this brings us to the surprisal-based predictive coding framework, because a construction with a low frequency can be accounted for as a prediction error, because we usually predict something that we hear the most. Active structures, they don't dominate our language, and passive we don't usually expect. So this would serve as a prediction error in structural priming. And then as you are gradually more and more exposed to priming over trials, this prediction error will not draw so much attention anymore. It will get minimized. You will get used to the fact that passive is also a legitimate maybe option in this setting. Thus, your expectations would change. So this is an implicit learning opportunity.
I think it would be fair to say that in all of this process that you have mentioned, also this error-based learning framework plays a really important role. It takes a really central place, actually, especially in the context of predictive coding. And according to this concept of predictive coding, and I'm quoting from your research, perception and action are guided by internal models that generate predictions about upcoming inputs. So maybe could you a little bit more concretize on this error-based learning in the framework of predictive coding, and how do prediction errors, perhaps at an implicit level, become part of the language learning mechanism?
Of course, predictive coding, or the predictive brain, as Clark, the author of this theory, put it, this is a theory that postulates that our brain constantly generates predictions about upcoming input, and these predictions, they are structured as a model, an intrinsic model of our expectation. And this isn't limited to language. It is also common in other perceptive areas, like visually, we are anticipating something, auditorily, we are anticipating specific cues. So we always have, according to this theory, some kind of prediction of what is going to happen or come next. And then we are faced with the actual input from the environment. And if there is a mismatch or a discrepancy between what we expect and what we actually see, this elicits a prediction error because we didn't expect that. This is a useful tool, or a useful maybe conceptualization of a learning opportunity. Because as I have already mentioned, there is this very certain assumption that we always try to optimize everything we do so that it costs us less processing effort. And prediction theory also assumes that it is true in regard to, for instance, linguistic processing. So we expect things because if we meet something that we expected before, this is processed faster and easier. We were prepared for this. If we weren't prepared, then we see this as something salient, something that stands out on the background of already predicted and expected things. So we can learn from it. Learn with the purpose of minimizing this discrepancy so that the next time we do not experience so much perplexion and so much maybe processing effort that should go into seeing or hearing something novel. So this is where implicit learning and prediction errors, with their minimization as framed by predictive coding theory, come into play together. So via prediction error minimization, we can implicitly learn. And also when it comes to structural priming, which is a way of implicit learning, because we infer patterns that we do not really realize, which makes it implicit. So in regard to structural priming as implicit learning, there is a lot of evidence that native speakers do that, and they do it better if they encounter a prediction error within priming. So if they're just plainly primed for a structure, chances are high that they will produce it again, but chances are likely even higher that the structure is going to be produced again if they experience an embedded in the priming prediction error, because prediction error draws attention very strongly. It stands out a lot. So, and my research aims at proving or maybe checking if the same mechanism works with second language acquisition, because this is a very fruitful and maybe desirable outcome for second language learners, to be able to learn something without realizing that, because this is definitely easier and more pleasant, which we know, for instance, by learning English as a foreign language. We usually do it at school, in the elementary school, and a lot of people report that being surrounded by maybe English-speaking cultures as music, films, and so after and so on, we get used to this language more, and then learning it becomes easier. And a lot of people say that they reached B1 level in English without truly realizing the patterns in an academic, bookish sense, what the syntactic structures are, for example. This is the exact type of implicit learning that I think people would wish to have a little bit more. Also, when it comes to languages that are not so well distributed as, so well spread as English, for instance, German.
Actually, it's also really fascinating to learn that this language learning process, apart from first language acquisition, works implicitly in some certain extent. And I'd like to, in an exaggerated way, give this example of there are some videos in YouTube that try to teach you learning while you are sleeping. I don't know whether they are really beneficial or really effective in language learning processes, but I think they are also trying to invoke maybe the same grounding in terms of learning language so that you will be exposed to language while you are sleeping. But of course, you are the expert maybe. Do you have an idea whether they are beneficial in terms of language learning?
I believe that our cognition is very different when we are asleep. And even you can see it on oscillations that you can measure, for instance, with electroencephalography or magnetoencephalography. So there are different types of oscillations that bind to specific types of activity that is more or less demanding, like alpha, delta, theta, gamma. And during sleep, if I'm not mistaken, we usually have alpha oscillations that are resting state activity type. And this state doesn't allow us to process new information. I think that the main function of a sleep period in our life, speaking as a person who doesn't know much about neurology of sleep, but just assuming, I think that it is more for consolidation of everything that we have acquired already in active cognitive states, and usually also memory consolidation as of coming from short-term memory via hippocampus to long-term memory. It is also associated with sleep a lot. So what I think is that we're probably less likely to be able to acquire any new information during sleep, which would have been great, but unfortunately, I think it's not very efficient. But nonetheless, these implicit ways or mechanisms, they look very attractive, but I think they function at best when we are completely awake and conscious.
At least we can say that as a takeaway, maybe don't try it before your exams. I mean, if you haven't worked on your exams, that will not save you. Just listening some kind of a YouTube video before the night of the exam wouldn't save you actually, or could not provide you good grades maybe. But yeah, please.
Sure, but it will help to consolidate everything that you have heard actually
Right.
being awake at lectures before.
Yeah. I think it's also a great point to delve into your hypothesis, specific hypothesis in your research and the experimental environment designed to test them. So, in the light of what you have explained so far, could you walk us through the experimental procedure and explain how these steps help validate or falsify your hypothesis? So, maybe let's start with the hypothesis and then you can walk us through the experimental process.
Yeah, so my hypotheses are firstly that second language learners also experience structural priming effects. Then the second hypothesis that I have is that they are able to show cumulative priming effects that accumulate over trials and over time. The third hypothesis is that the participants of my experiment can experience prediction error when it is embedded in structural priming. And then maybe the last and the most important thing is that it can all be brought together and lead to implicit learning. So there is some evidence that structural priming can lead to short-term priming effects or to long-term priming effects, and long-term priming effects, they can gradually develop into implicit learning, into something that actually stays with us even after long-term priming effects of the experiment are gone after a week at most. So these are my assumptions, and the way that I'm planning to test it is an experimental way. So generally, when it comes to cognition and language, there are three branches that can provide us with something novel. The first branch is cognitive linguistics, and cognitive linguistics is theoretically based. This branch of cognitive language science, it elaborates on conceptualization and categorization. So how we build concepts and how we categorize them into classes to better understand our environment. And this involves different theories, for instance, conceptual metaphor theory, that metaphors that we use in language, they are not just an expressive means, but they are actually a cognitive mechanism of perceiving something or describing something. Then there is also an interesting theory by Eleanor Roche, which is a prototype theory, that for every category that has a lot of items, we have the prototypical item. For instance, when you think about fruits, most people from, I think, European or Northern Western cultures would think of an apple. Of course, this is also culturally different, but the thing is, a language shapes this prototypical category.
Or trees, for example.
Yeah.
When we are talking about trees, every person coming from a different culture also think about a different tree, actually.
Yes, I think of a pine tree,
Mhm.
for instance. Okay, and then next to cognitive linguistics that develops or has developed a lot of theories, like also generative grammar, there is neurolinguistics that is aimed at collecting neural evidence of brain activity that is correlated with our language abilities or language processing. So this research, in their paradigms, they use magnetoencephalography or fMRI, also near-infrared spectroscopy, which is a novel method that can provide similar evidences of fMRI, but without using big MRI machine. So also we have a project that is a cooperation between the Kopf Clinic, the head clinic at University Heidelberg, and the Institute of German as a Foreign Language, where we do research on psychoacoustic correlates that have to do with language processing as well, and we do magnetoencephalography there. This is a method where you measure magnetic fields that come from neurons, because neurons have electrical activity inside of them, and to communicate between each other, they use electric currents. And every electric current has a magnetic field. So these magnetic fields, they can also be aggregated, and this aggregated signal can be measured. So this is something that neurolinguistics does. But psycholinguistics, well, it's a comparable science that also measures cognitive activity that comes from language processing, but with secondary evidence, so to say. The primary evidence would be something that comes directly from the brain, and secondary evidence, as I put it, would be something behavioral responses, reaction times, something that we produce, the reaction that we have after we comprehend something. So this is what you usually do in psycholinguistic experiments. And in my experimental paradigm, I will measure behavioral responses such as reaction times, what patterns, what structures people will produce, and also, most importantly and most interestingly, eye saccades. So I use a method that is called eye tracking that is able to track the pupils and usually different types of gaze behavior, such as saccades or drifts or fixations of our eyes on a screen. And this is where visual paradigm comes into play. So visual world paradigm, this is an experimental setup that allows you to show visual entities to participants. So they see something on the screen, we track their gaze, and we can see what was fixated more, which part of the picture, what the person was processing at the moment. Of course, we cannot for sure say that this specific saccade is definitely connected to the fact that the person was processing this word that stands for this visual entity. But generally, our gaze fixations and our language processing have to do with each other. In the sense of prediction, with eye tracking, you can also measure predictions that people make, because we're always preparing to hear some input, and we are always preparing for the next step, so to say. So in eye tracking, if we have not a visual world paradigm, but just a text, and you have, for instance, an unpredictable word, you see that the gaze will stop at this word, probably telling us that this processing took a little bit more time than the processing of previous words. And also, when people make predictions, they tend to look at something that they predict. So imagine there is a sentence, and the sentence has the German definite article that is of a specific grammatical gender. And then it has a gap. And you have two pictures, one picture that corresponds to the presented article and one that does not. Most likely people will fixate on the picture before they even hear the word. Of course, they will fixate on the picture that aligns with the article because they are preparing to process it more efficiently. So this is how we can also make judgments about predictions. And what I do in my experiment, I will also judge the anticipatory eye saccades that are evident for active or passive structure choice, depending on what the person fixates first, the agent or the patient, that are both presented on the picture. The question is, what do you then do with this data? And there are different approaches. I would say that to do psycholinguistic research, a specific statistical knowledge is always required. Of course, generally, conducting research that has to do with people and that tries to explain and measure something of human nature always involves a big variety of different skills that you need, beginning with recruiting participants, and you have to be socially apt to distribute the information about your study, find people. But also you have to be able to sketch a draft, a design that would be plausible and in line with the previous research. You have to be able to construct such an experiment. So you need maybe a little bit of coding background knowledge, but you can also conduct psycholinguistic experiments in psychological softwares like PsychoPy or OpenSesame that are constructors. So you don't have to write it yourself, but you have to be able to understand where it comes from and what can be adjusted for your specific paradigm. And then when you gather the data, you need to be able to statistically work with it, to plot it, and most importantly, to interpret it. So with this anticipatory saccades, we will apply computational models, statistical models such as Bayesian model and reinforced learning model as well. So these are models that can deal with the outcome that is not yet there. So these models, they can predict the behavior of participants depending on the given priors or the given information that we know. So Bayesian model can maybe quantify dealing with uncertainty, and reinforcement learning model can help us to predict what the behavior of a person who has learned what it will look like.
Well, thank you so much for your extensive elaboration on this process, and also you paved the way for my next question, because I also like to move on to the methodology part, and you are working in an interdisciplinary area in which you are combining psycholinguistic methods, computational modeling, and cognitive science. And in which ways do you feel that interdisciplinary approach enriches your research, actually?
I think that interdisciplinary approach is very important, and especially in regard to sciences that have the same object, or in case of people, the same subject. So I think that the psychology, neurology, linguistics, psycholinguistics, pedagogics, methodology, they should all work together, because experts from another field can inform you on something that you are only slightly aware of or that you have not extensively delved into, which is always a great contribution. So I think that psycholinguistics, as a joining of two sciences already, psychology and linguistics, has to cooperate with other fields, which I see the colleagues who come from the field always do, and which I'm very glad about. And our university also offers a lot of opportunities for this. For instance, we have these cooperations that I mentioned before with hospital of the university. Of course, there are cooperations also on the basis of cognitive science. There is, for instance, core facility for neuroscience of self-regulation that offers an opportunity for researchers from different fields to use the laboratory equipment to conduct research, maybe in an intersection that would bring people who are interested in cognitive science together.
Actually, that's really great to hear that you have this environment in which you can also develop your project, and also you are working with really amazing people in terms of helping your project and also guiding you and also questioning sometimes your projects in terms of contributing its development. And there is an aspect actually in your project that we haven't concentrated yet. You are working with learners of German as a second language whose native language is Russian and who come from different backgrounds. We mentioned it briefly, but that may perhaps cause a generalizability problem in terms of the results of your research. So I'd like to first, in this framework, ask you, how do the properties of German language, the target language as a second language, play a role in your research framework? So what makes German distinct? Of course, you are working at the University of Heidelberg. That's probably the reason that you chose this language in your research topic. But German has some distinct properties. So maybe would you like to concretize on that?
Yes, sure. So, as for your first question about generalizability in terms of inferential statistics, so the designs of such experiments that are meant to explain behavior of a specific cohort of people always try to eliminate as much variables that can bring in diversity as much as possible, which concerns, for instance, some things that you can preliminary measure before you conduct the main experiment. You can give people a socio-demographical survey with their age, background, the level of their bilingualism or multilingualism. So what languages they speak, on what levels, whether they have maybe any vision impairments or other factors that are relevant for you. And on these grounds, knowing this, you can either cluster participants or just exclude criteria that is not favorable. Also, you can measure difference in cognitive abilities. This is usually done by having preliminary tests on working memory or on attention span, because these abilities also play a role in our linguistic processing, and when people differ there, they will have different outcomes that will not have to necessarily do anything with our experimental manipulation, but will have to do with divergence in the first place. That's why when you evaluate the data statistically, you bring these factors in, and then if you see that there is a correlation with some general cognitive ability, like with memory, then you can say that your results are not necessarily psycholinguistic, but they have to do with something else. This is how you keep it stable generally. But when we talk about second language learners who share the same native language, of course, you're right that there is a huge variety of people who can fall into this category. First of all, people who come from countries of the native language and heritage speakers of the second language who were born and raised in this country, they, of course, differ qualitatively. Then again, it depends in what setting your second language learning took place. Was it a university? Was it a school? Was it your own private learning with different goals? So in order to stabilize this, I will recruit participants with a specific language level above B1, which is intermediate. And this will give me a reassurance that all of these people, despite the fact that their learning was qualitatively different, they have the same level of knowledge for comprehension, for perception, and production. And of course, I will exclude people who are bilingual or who are heritage speakers, because these people, again, have a little bit different set of features that can and should be compared to native speakers and second language learners, but they are not necessarily equal and not comparable in the sense that you can place these people in the same group. This is how I'm planning to deal with this. And as for German, of course, you're right that research on German language is done at our institute a lot. Of course, for the reason that we are placed in Germany and we also all speak and like German language a lot. But also German language is very relevant. So it is spoken by a lot of people in a variety of countries, and it poses a specific difficulty. German, in its syntactical structure, has a word order that is not rigid, but it has a very fixed verb positions. And these verbal positions, they pose a difficulty for people who speak languages that have a free word order. So analytical languages, they do not have any flexions in a sense of they don't have endings that can change according to the case. They don't have changing articles, no declination, no conjugation. They just have a word, and depending on where this word is put, it can be interpreted in different functions. Also, the word surroundings plays a role. We all know languages like that. For instance, English. English has some flexion rudiments, so to say, that are left from previous times, like conjugation of the third person singular in verbs. But mostly it's analytical. And German, it has a lot of flexions. And nonetheless, the word order is still very fixed. And Russian, in comparison, is also very synthetical, but this nature of showing specific functions via cases, declinations, or conjugations, it allows the language to move the units across the sentence without losing any meaning or maybe transmitting the same message. It only has a stylistic difference, a pragmatical difference. So you would maybe place a sentence not in subject-verb-object matter, but in object-subject-verb, which is also possible, just to express something that is more exclamatory, more poetic. But generally you can do it. In German you cannot do this. And especially in passive structures that I research, it is a complex structure, meaning it has two parts, not only one. And these parts have a very specific placement, usually on the second place in a sentence and at the very end. So you can imagine that the whole sentence that is embedded into this passive structure, it needs a lot of executive control, as we already mentioned. So you should be able to keep the second participle in mind along the way as you produce the sentence. And of course, for skills like that, implicit learning would be very useful.
Well, thank you so much. And at the end of the content and methodology part of our podcast, I would like to ask one final question, because you also mentioned about that you are working with the learners of German as a second language, whose native language is Russian. So I think that's also related with the gap that you are trying to fill in the literature, I guess. In that sense, I'd like to then ask you which aspects of language learning have already been examined within the framework of structural priming, but maybe more specifically in the second language learning, and what gaps are you aiming to fill with your research, actually?
This is a very good question, because there is actually similar research that is also done with structural priming with different structures, but with structures that don't resemble active-passive syntactic choice. There is research on other constructions such as prepositional objects or dative object constructions in English, as of I give you this or I give this to you. So people have been primed for the less frequent item of this pair, which is the prepositional phrase. It is longer, that's why it's not as frequent as a dative object. And another thing that is met a lot are relative clauses, nominal relative clauses that begin with an object or with a subject. So what comes first? So you see, there is a specific list of structures that have been researched. And I think that the novelty of my work relies on the fact that the methodology that I'm going to use is a bit more adjusted. So it's a paradigm that exists, but I did bring in novelty into this, and hopefully it will work.
I'm pretty sure that it will perfectly work, and we are looking forward to read the results of your PhD project. Thank you so much for this informative interview. And as a tradition, I also prepared you 2 personal questions in which you can also share us your personal reflections. First, I'd like to ask you, because you have your own experience with second language learning, including learning German and English at different stages of your life. So what was your personal experience like actually? Did learning these languages at different ages make a difference? Because you learned English, I think, before you learned German in a different period of your life.
Yes, that's exactly right. My first foreign language is English and German is the second one, even though this balance was distorted by the fact that at university I majorly learned and studied German from different perspectives. So at some point in the past, I could say that I speak German better than English, but then now I'm at this equilibrium that I really like. But this definitely makes a difference because, in the sense of linguistic interference, when the previously learned or your native language interferes with next, it is easier to acquire the next Germanic language that is very similar in some properties, especially in vocabulary. So, German was not as complicated, I think, to learn as many other languages could be. I also learned Hebrew and French, and they were a bit more challenging than German. So English is a good base to learn another Germanic language, and the foreign language that you learn first, maybe as a child at elementary school, I think that it also has a lot of implicit learning to it. So even if it is in a school setting, maybe we could agree on the fact that children don't always take up all of the information from the class and can recollect it being adult, but the fact that they are exposed at this early age plays a big role. So I think that my English acquisition in the sense went easier and a little bit more smoothly, and German was featured by more explicit learning. And I think that the older we get, the more complicated it gets maybe to acquire new knowledge. Maybe this is not true for all of the people, but generally it has to do with the fact that at a specific point of age, after 30 or 40, we have less neurological development and more neuronal decay, and that's why all of the cognitive abilities, they gradually degrade. It's called neuronal degeneration. And of course, the later we start, the harder it will be and the more explicit it should be.
Bad news for the people who are above 30 or 40, I guess. But this fact shouldn't also discourage them from learning a new language because that also brings a lot of benefits with it. But I also like to ask you, because you have an expertise right now in this language learning and also in this discipline, and at least in the scientific perspective, looking back now with an expert perspective, then how would you evaluate your experiences with language learning? Has becoming an expert in this field changed the way you reflect on your own language learning journey? And maybe as an extra question, are you planning to learn a new language apart from English, German, French, and Hebrew right now, so that you can also maybe use your scientific background in new language learning journeys? There are many questions. You can choose the one that pleases you.
So, first of all, before I answer the great questions, I wanted to briefly say that despite the fact that there is this gradual neurological degeneration, so to say, with age as we get older, I think that people who speak foreign languages and who are open to learning new things, they keep their cognitive abilities very active and maybe they're more prominent and efficient. And with age, these degenerative processes that inevitably happen to all of us with the older we get, they don't have such big effects. Simultaneous interpreters who on daily basis deal with the fact that they have to comprehend one language in one ear and then produce something in another language, they have an extremely demanding, cognitively demanding job. These people do get less dementia, do get less Alzheimer's, and generally the more languages we speak, the more neuronal connections we have, the more we are able to suppress and to activate, which speaks for maybe better at some point regularity abilities. And this is also very important for cognitive clarity and for maintaining this clarity along your lifespan. So definitely being bilingual, being multilingual, having a job that has to do with maybe international connections, this is very advantageous for us.
Thank you for the clarification, actually. Yeah. So that we are not doing this really terrible job with discouraging people, at least above the age 30 and 40, to learn a new language. But as an expert, what would you say about your past experiences in learning language? Or because you are just fed up with all of these scientific knowledge about the second language acquisition, you are not really keen to learn new languages maybe in the future? I don't know. I'm just asking a provocative question here.
Coming back to your questions, I do plan to learn languages further because I think that the linguistic variety that we possess is fascinating. And doing my master's, I also participated in courses that deal with field research in indigenous Siberian nations that speak Finno-Ugric languages. And I also had some experience with that. And I find it so interesting how every language is a different perspective. It's a different world perception setting. And learning a new language gives you more outlook to the world. And I do definitely plan to learn French as we are next to the French border. This would be very nice to be able to speak French better than I do now. And I maybe do not have any specific novel interest now, but it will most definitely spark. And as for my experience, I think that people who have a philological background in any sense, in literature sciences, also philology that deals only with their native language, not foreign language philology, they have a different outlook on the whole process of learning the language, because people who deal with a word or with language as an instrument of their profession have a bit of professional deformation, so to say. And this makes the insight into the new language maybe a bit more conscious, because you have had these experiences with other languages before, which allows you to learn new languages better and which I enjoy. And yes, I definitely think that my background helps me in this nice activity.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's also really fascinating to explore this relationship between language and culture. Of course, there's again, chicken problem there. We don't know which component actually affects the other, but there's a maybe interrelationship between those two concepts, culture and language. And if you are really wondering about some aspects of the linguistic relativity theory, which also concentrates on this issue, this relationship between language and culture, I would also recommend you to listen actually our episode with Dr. Gerwin from the Heidelberg University, in which we also explored some aspects of the linguistic relativity theory. So thank you so much, Eliza, again for this wonderful interview. And if you liked our episodes, please don't forget to check our other episodes. And Eliza and I are saying goodbye to you. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the HGGS podcast series, Ascendem. In this series, we bring you conversations with experts from a wide range of disciplines, from the social sciences to the humanities, from law to economics. If you enjoyed our podcast, we invite you to explore our previous episodes and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a new episode. Stay tuned for more insightful interviews coming soon.